Hello and welcome to the 18th episode of the Eternal Top 10 series. In this series I talk about the 10 cards with the most competitive success in Eternal's history that fulfill a certain condition. In this case they have to be a burn spell. For that I compiled a list of all decks that topped an official Direwolf event or reached top 8 in the ETS seasons of 2017 and 18. The ranking is then based on a point system. Each tier 1 top grants 2 points and each tier 2 top grants 1. Tiers are either based on how far the deck went or on how important the event was. For a more detailed explanation, check out the introduction video on my channel. There is no universally agreed upon definition for burn spells. The only shared characteristics in most are that they are spells that can deal damage to the opponent, but opinions differ as to whether spells that can also deal damage to units still count as burn spells, and if spells need to deal a specific minimum amount of damage to be considered a burn spell. For a list like this I have to use an exact definition though, otherwise I just can't choose the cards. And the definition I went with is that I consider any card with the spell card type, that means spells or fast spells, that can deal at least 2 damage on its own to the opponent a burn spell. That means that spells that can also hit units like Icicle are legal for the list, but spells that only deal 1 damage aren't, which means that Condemn and Calb Favor, which would have had enough points to make this list, could not make it. That is of course a very subjective definition, but dealing 1 damage just doesn't really feel like a burn spell to me when a player starts with 25 health, and also being able to deal damage to a unit doesn't change the fact that a spell can deal burn damage, so I wanted to count in spells that can also deal damage to units. As always, feel free to write your guesses about which cards made the top of the list, or your questions about how close some cards that you expected to see missed out in the comments below. Let's start. On rank 10 we have Vicious Overgrow. It's a 2-power single primal influence uncommon spell that deals 3 overwhelm damage, and you can amplify it for 2 power to add a random primal card to your market. Overgrow was a solid removal option for any primal deck in set 10 and 11 Expedition, because it could efficiently kill problematic cheap units, like Whispering Wind or D'Angelo Houndmaster, deal some face damage, or remove Aegis, which was important in set 11 to enable relic removal against Waxing Moon decks, or to get an exploit through in slower matchups. Growth also had additional synergy with some cards in Expedition, for example in TGP and Horror Soldiers, where it could be drawn with Dovit's effect, and in FPS Tesseract, where it drew cards with the namesake unit, and where it could be drawn with Realign the Stars, if you wanted a cheap damage spell that could interact with your Tessa. In Throne, Overgrow only saw sporadic play in 2021 in the main deck of Primal Midrange and Control decks, and in the Blazing Salvo market of Skycrack Acro. But thanks to the general higher card quality, especially the existence of more efficient removal, it wasn't a staple anywhere, and it completely dropped out of competitive significance after Salvo's cost was doubled in late 2021. Next up we have Pyrotech Explosion. It's a 3-power double fire influence rare spell that deals 4 damage through Aegis, and you can double the damage with Amplify 5, which means it deals 8 damage for 8 power, 16 damage for 13 power, 32 damage for 18 power, and so on. In Expedition, Pyrotech was often just played for similar reasons as Overgrow, because it was fairly efficient removal that could also be used as burn damage. Contrary to Overgrow, it was almost exclusively played in aggro decks though, because the Aegis condition meant that it was a consistent way to finish games, and because fire was, like usually, mostly an aggressive faction. The one really big exception was Overloader Combo, FPS in set 10 and at the start of set 11, and FGPS at the end of set 11. That deck could generate a ton of power with Overloader and cheap amplify effects like Hardiness or Diabolic Machinations. Machinations, which was nerfed to cost 2 instead of 1 life per amplify in June 2021 to make the deck more vulnerable to early pressure, was simultaneously a way to get a ton of power with Overloader, because the amplify effect didn't cost you power, so as long as you had a decent amount of life you could generate a ton of power with Overloader, and it was also a way to find your finishes by digging deep into your deck. And the best finisher for the deck was Pyrotech Explosion. It could easily kill any opponent, even if they gain some life, thanks to the immense power from Overloader. It didn't get stopped by Phase Eaches, and it could be searched with Realign the Stars, which was already a good card in the deck because it could also search the formerly mentioned enablers. In Throne format, Pyrotech had less success and was pretty much exclusively played as finisher and Overloader combo decks throughout the years. Next up we have Transpose. On release, it was a 1-power single primal influence rare fast spell that dealt 1 damage to the opponent, gave yourself Eaches, and allowed you to swap a card from your hand with a 4-cost card from your market, which means it wouldn't be legal based on my definition of burn spells because it only dealt 1 damage, but it was quickly buffed to 2 damage, so I still included it. Transpose was released in Set 8 Echoes of Eternity in early 2020, next to 4 other 1-cost fast spells that could access the market, each for a different faction and a different power cost, which all saw a lot of competitive play. Contrary to the other 4, Transpose wasn't very successful in Expedition, at least in Set 8 and 9 format, where it only saw sporadic play in mid-range and control decks, mostly ones with expensive relics to protect them from relic removal. Relic protection became even more important in late Set 9 and in Set 10 Expedition, thanks to the release of Sling of the Chi, a very powerful relic that was already hard enough to remove in Expedition, thanks to a low number of efficient dwelling removal, but it got even more difficult if the opponent had a Transpose. With the help of Transpose, Skystrike Sling won the World Championship 2020 in the hands of Lights Out Ace, and 4-faction Sling was very well represented in the only Set 10 Expedition ICQ in early 2021. After which, Transpose rotated out of the format. In Throne, it had a bit of a rough start as well. It didn't get a single top at the ICQs in February and April 2020, but after the buff to 2 damage and, even more importantly, the release of Silverblade Menace, it had a very strong showing at the Spring Seasonal in May 2020. Menace was a big problem for control and spell-heavy midrange decks because outside of Phase Eaches, there weren't a lot of ways to counter it, especially because she was mostly played in the market, making hand hate less effective. Fast speed Phase Eaches was a great way to counter her, which is why Transpose saw a fair amount of play in Horu, Feln, and to a lesser extent Skyrick and FGP control, but it was also a good way to get Menace from the market, best used in the Feln midrange deck that several top players brought to the Spring Seasonal in May 2020. That deck played Blight Pest Smuggler as main deck market access because of the synergy with Mother of Skies, but it did play a market copy of Transpose and of Menace, which meant it could grab Transpose with the Smuggler, break the opponent's Eaches with the Transpose, and then get Menace with it for lethal, unless the opponent had a Transpose themselves. Towards the end of 2020 and for most of 2021, the main use of Transpose in Throne was to grab and or protect strong relics, like Sling or Worldpire, and essential combo pieces like Eccentric Officer, against relic removal or hand hate. Despite a mediocre 2021 season, it was basically banned in the Big Balance patch on September 2nd, 2021, where its cost was doubled up to 2 and the Phase Eaches effect removed completely. As expected, it hasn't seen any competitive play since. On rank 7, we have our first and only multi-faction spell, Display of Instinct. It's a 3-power, single fire, time and primal influence uncommon fast spell that lets you choose between 3 options. You can either deal 4 to an enemy, which is the reason for it being on this list, put one of your units in your hand and gain life equal to its health, or negate an enemy spell. While none of its effects is fully on raid, and while only the 4 damage option is generally enough for main deck inclusion, the flexibility of 3 decently strong effects, all good at different things, made it a strong utility choice in any deck that could play it, which back in its first competitive season in 2019 was basically only FTP Howling Peak midrange. That deck could use the 4 damage to get rid of early threats and problematic sites like Howling Peak or Corrivied Palace, or occasionally as burn damage. The spell negate came up in grinding midrange mirrors to counter high value spells like Display of Ambition or Harsh Rule, and the bounce effect, while less important, could also protect against removal, stabilize against aggro, or allow you to reuse summon or summon-like effects. Thanks to some nerfs and general power creep, FTP midrange died out after a last small stint in early 2020 though, which left Display without a deck. The few times FTP deck popped up again, for example with FTP Acro in mid-2021, display was also just not quite good enough anymore. Next up, we have our first set 1 card, Calb's Favor. It's a 2-power single fire influence common spell that deals 2 damage to the opponent and draws you a fire sigil. Favor saw a lot of play in set 1 format, mostly in aggressive decks because it was a decent way to play more than 25 power to consistently reach 4 or 5 power on curve for your strong plays like Bandit Queen or Soulfire Drake. Of course, they could have just played more than 25 power naturally, but the 2 damage from Favor helped with the game plan anyway and was at least somewhat on rate back then. With the release of more efficient burn, power surges and merchants, which also helped Acro get to 4 power more consistently, Calb's Favor dropped out of competitive significance and throne, except for a few tops in Blazing Salvo markets in 2020. Thanks to the same card, it also saw a fair amount of expedition play in set 8 and 9 format. Unless you really wanted Petition to fix your influence or to get specific power cards, Calb's Favor was the best way to get additional power in the Salvo market, especially for aggressive decks because they profited the most from the burn damage. After Salvo rotated out of Expedition, Calb's Favor rarely showed up in the format, only getting 2 tops in Monofire Acro in 2022. On rank 5, we have our most expensive card on the list, Chiron the Tempest. It's a 9 power, or on release 8 power, quadruple primal influence rare spell that draws 3 cards and then deals damage equal to the number of cards in your hand. It was a very important finisher and value option for control and sometimes midrange decks in 2017 and 18. In 2017 it was mostly played in Felon control, which could usually search it with Celestial Omen, and in TGP Chalice, and in 2018 it got most of its stops from Felon control and TGP control, but it was also played in a number of other decks. The nerf from 8 to 9 power at the end of 2018 reduced its play rate quite a bit in 2019, in which it only got 4 tops in horror control, but it did rise back in 2020 and 2021. In 2020 Throne it was played in the market or as a one-off in Skycrake horror and FGP control. Both Skycrake and FGP played Garden of Omens in the main deck, so they could search their 1 copy of Channel with Resurfers in games that went longer. In 2021 it was played in those same decks and fell at any cost, but it began to fade out more and more. In Expedition it saw some play in 2020 Control and Worldpire decks, but its real time to shine came with the release of Davia Azure Breaker. Channel was used as one of the best targets for Davia in Felon, Skycrake and FPS decks in 2021. In the later 2 sometimes as a market card that you could ditch with Shorthopper to then replay it with Davia. And it was also played again in TGP control in early 2022 as a Davia target. Next up we have Flame Blast. It's a 1 power triple fire influence uncommon spell that spends all your remaining power to deal that much damage. Like Calb's Favor, Flame Blast was mostly played in Acro decks in 2017, but it saw a lot more play than Favor because its burn potential was much higher, and because it could also act as flexible removal if necessary. Because of the immense burn potential, it was nerfed towards the end of the 2017 season and didn't see any play until it was reverted in April 2019. Despite that season being more than halfway done, Flame Blast managed to get 43 tops in 2019, including 2 ICQ wins and a top 4 at Worlds, mostly in the main deck and occasionally market of Stone Scar Acro. In 2020 it had another great season, but now mostly relegated to the market. In Stone Scar Acro, which was still Flame Blast's most important home, the market access of choice was usually Condemn. Blast was a perfect fit for Condemn markets for several reasons. Firstly, it was the best 1-cost option to get if you had a lot of otherwise unused power. Secondly, the cheaper cost and the fast speed of Condemn made it a better fit for situational cards that needed a lot of power compared to Merchants or Smugglers. And thirdly, Condemn could break Aegis on a unit or the opponent to get the damage of Flame Blast through. In 2021, Flame Blast barely saw any play because Stone Scar Acro switched to Ken Waste Smuggler as market access of choice, who provided more flexibility and access to alternative burn options like Silverblade Menace. But Condemn and with it Flame Blast came back in 2022 thanks to the attack reduction of Smuggler and the release of the Frenzy mechanic. With strong Frenzy units like in Stone Scar, like Stone Scar Adept or Nico, Enablers like Condemn and Flame Blast could put a ton of pressure on the opponent and end games quickly. We go right to the next set 1 fire burn spell, Obliterate. It's a 5 power, double fire influence rare spell that deals 6 overwhelm damage. In 2017, Obliterate saw play in similar decks as Flame Blast, but the higher base cost and the fact that Overwhelm made it better as unit removal led to it seeing slightly less play in aggro, but a lot more play in midrange decks, like Praxis or Stonescar midrange. It was still very important for aggro because it was able to remove problematic units like Sandstorm Titan somewhat efficiently, while not being a dead card if the opponent only had small units or no units at all. Contrary to Flame Blast, Obliterate wasn't nerfed and continued seeing play in decks like Praxis midrange, Praxis tokens and Stonescar aggro in 2018, and in Rakano, Skycrack and Stonescar aggro in 2019. But people started to play fewer copies and or delegate it to the market, because aggro became faster and rarely wanted to pay 5 for just 6 damage anymore. But at least Obliterate managed to get a few last tops in the main deck of Skycrack aggro, and the market of FTP token and Stonescar aggro decks in Set 9 Expedition before it completely faded out of competitive relevancy in 2021. On rank 2 we stay in fire but get to a much newer card with Seer. It's a 2 power single fire influence fast spell at uncommon that deals 3 damage. That means it is just a significantly worse version of original Torch and still weaker than Nerf Torch in most situations. So the fact that it made rank 2 is a testament on the insane power level of Torch. Seer was a staple in Set 8 and 9 Expedition, outside of high synergy decks like FTS or FTP tokens that rarely played Seer because they needed space for proactive cards that supported their gameplay. It was played in almost all fire decks, usually in the main deck, but also sometimes as efficient burn or removal option in Blazing Salvo markets. Despite Torch being legal in Throne, contrary to Set 8 or 9 Expedition, Seer also saw a ton of Throne play, at least in 2020 and 2021. In Throne, it was mostly played in aggro decks as additional copies of Torch, that sometimes were better because they could hit sides, or be used in combat or in response to other spells. In 2020, that included Stonescar, Skycrack and Monofire aggro, but also some Skycrack control lists, and in 2021, Skycrack aggro, Skycrack Yetis and FTP aggro. Although at that point, mainly in Blazing Salvo markets and rarely in the main deck. With the cost increase of Blazing Salvo from 1 to 2, the release of more Torch alternatives, and a slow but steady trend to cut removal in favor of proactive cards, Seer became irrelevant for competitive play in 2022. And to no one's surprise, with 5 times the points of Seer, our rank 1 is Torch. It's a 1 power single fire influence spell, fast on release, that deals 3 damage to a unit or player, and like most of the last 4 cards, it was released in Set 1, the Empty Throne. Torch is the non-power card with the most points and tops in the history of Eternal. Maybe it still is even if you include power. From 2017 to 19, it was in more decks than Fire Sigil, which means it was in almost all fire decks. Additionally, it was almost never played at less than 4 copies, and almost always in the main board or main deck instead of sideboard or market. The sheer efficiency of it made it attractive for every kind of deck, no matter if aggro, mid-range, control or combo. It was also very flexible. It could kill smaller units, kill bigger units that you already damaged, remove eaches, kill relic weapons, or just deal some burn damage. The fact that it was fast at that point in time meant that it could also be used to make your opponents guess which fast spell you have. For example, if you had Finest Hour or Torch in your Rakano aggro deck. It could also be used to save quick draw units in combat against bigger units, or to kill things at the end of the opponent's turn, or in response to spells like Finest Hour or Mirror Image. Those applications all went away with the nerf to slow speed in late 2019, but even after, the Torch was still the best removal and burn spell in the game, proven by the consistently high numbers of tops until 2022. Some fire decks started to drop it though, in 2020 only sporadically in Rakano Influence, in 2021 and 2022 more commonly in decks like Skygrixeling, Stonescar Seal or FGS Midrange. But the addition to Set 12 Expedition allowed Torch to prove its sheer power once more. In 2021 it saw some success in the last few tournaments of the season, but a real show of strength came in 2022. It was only Expedition legal for the first tournament of the year, but it was a big reason for Rakano Agro's success, and it was part of almost half the list that topped that event. This marks the end of the 18th episode of the Eternal Top 10 series. You can find the previous episodes and my deck history videos on my channel. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Have a nice week. End.